You wake up on a cold February morning in 1872 in a cramped boarding house near the British Museum in London. The air smells of coal smoke and damp wool. You are George Smith, a 32-year-old engraver's apprentice turned self-taught Assyriologist, and today you will hold in your hands a clay fragment that will shake the foundations of biblical scholarship and ignite a controversy about human origins that continues to this day. But let me take you back further, because the story of how humanity came to question its own genesis through ancient Mesopotamian texts begins not with dramatic revelations, but with the mundane, methodical work of sorting through thousands upon thousands of broken clay tablets in the museum's dusty basement. George Smith was not born into privilege or academic circles. His father was a working-class man, and George himself began his career as an apprentice to a banknote engraver, learning the meticulous art of reproducing fine details. This skill, the ability to see patterns in fragments, to recognize the curve of a cuneiform wedge, to piece together broken narratives from incomplete evidence, would become his greatest asset. In 1863, he began spending his lunch hours at the British Museum, drawn inexplicably to the cases containing clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped writing from ancient Mesopotamia. The tablets themselves had arrived in London through a combination of archaeological ambition and what we might today call cultural appropriation. In the 1840s and 1850s, British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard had excavated the ancient Assyrian cities of Nimrud and Nineveh, shipping over 20,000 clay tablet fragments back to London. These weren't beautiful artifacts, they were administrative records, fragments of epic poems, religious texts, astronomical observations, and commercial transactions, all inscribed in cuneiform script that had been undecipherable until scholars like Henry Rawlinson cracked the code by studying the Behistun inscription in Persia. You need to understand the sheer volume of material involved. Imagine a basement room in the British Museum, poorly lit, perpetually cold, filled with wooden crates and shelves stacked with clay fragments ranging from the size of your thumbnail to pieces as large as dinner plates. Many were broken beyond recognition. Some still bore the marks of the fire that had destroyed Ashurbanipal's great library in 612 BCE, ironically the very conflagration that baked and preserved these tablets for posterity. Each piece was covered in tiny wedge-shaped impressions, pressed into wet clay over 2,500 years ago by scribes whose names we would never know. George Smith's daily routine was numbingly repetitive. He would arrive at the museum each morning, sign the visitor's log, and descend into the basement where the Assyrian collection was housed. He would carefully lift fragments from their storage boxes, examine them under lamplight, and attempt to match broken edges with other fragments. Sometimes he would spend an entire day examining a single tablet, trying to determine its context. Was it part of a royal inscription, a religious hymn, a merchant's inventory? The work required extraordinary patience and an almost obsessive attention to detail. What drove him? Smith himself left few personal reflections, but his colleagues noted his peculiar intensity. He seemed possessed by the conviction that these ancient texts contained something vital, something that modern civilization had forgotten. He taught himself Akkadian and Sumerian, the languages of ancient Mesopotamia, by comparing published translations with the cuneiform originals. He developed a system for cataloging the tablets by content and period, becoming so proficient that the museum hired him as an assistant in 1867. The significance of what Smith was doing cannot be overstated, yet it was profoundly boring work. Day after day, year after year, he sat in that basement, piecing together fragments of ancient literature. Most of what he read was mundane: records of grain shipments, lists of workers assigned to irrigation projects, astronomical observations recording the positions of Venus. Occasionally he would find something more interesting, a fragment of a royal inscription, a hymn to the god Marduk, a portion of an omen text predicting the future based on the appearance of sheep livers. But Smith was searching for something specific, though he may not have consciously known it at first. He was searching for stories, narratives that could connect the ancient Mesopotamian world to his own, that could provide context for the biblical accounts he had grown up hearing in Sunday school. The Assyrians and Babylonians were mentioned in the Bible, but always as antagonists, enemies of God's chosen people. What had their own literature been like? What stories had they told themselves about creation, about the gods, about humanity's place in the cosmos? In 1872, Smith was working through a collection of tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Assyrian Empire. Ashurbanipal had been a scholar king, obsessed with collecting and preserving the knowledge of his predecessors. His scribes had copied texts from throughout Mesopotamia, creating what was effectively the world's first systematically organized library. Among these texts was an epic poem that scholars had begun to piece together, known by its opening words, "He who saw the deep." This was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of a legendary Sumerian king who embarked on a quest for immortality. Smith had been working on fragments of this epic for several years, gradually reconstructing the narrative. The story was remarkable, sophisticated, psychologically complex, exploring themes of friendship, mortality, and the human condition in ways that felt surprisingly modern. But most of the text was concerned with Gilgamesh's adventures, his friendship with the wild man Enkidu, and his eventual acceptance of human mortality. Then on that February day, Smith picked up a particular tablet fragment from a newly opened crate. It was small, perhaps 3 inches by 4 inches, broken on all sides. Under the lamplight, he could make out portions of cuneiform text. As he began to translate, his hands reportedly began to shake. The fragment described a great flood that destroyed all of humanity. A god had warned a single righteous man to build a boat and save his family and the animals. After the flood subsided, the man sent out birds to search for dry land. First a dove, which returned. Then a swallow, which also returned. Finally a raven, which did not return, indicating that the waters had receded. Smith immediately recognized the parallel to the biblical story of Noah's Ark. But this wasn't a Hebrew text. It was Akkadian, written in cuneiform on a clay tablet that predated the earliest biblical manuscripts by well over 1,000 years. The implications were staggering. Either the biblical flood story was based on earlier Mesopotamian traditions, or both accounts recorded an actual historical event. Either possibility challenged the prevailing Victorian assumption that the Bible represented the original divinely inspired account of human history. Smith's excitement was so intense that, according to contemporary accounts, he began running around the room, and in a moment of unbridled emotion, started removing his clothing. His colleagues were alarmed, but Smith was experiencing something akin to a revelation. Here in his hands was physical evidence that the stories of the Bible had ancient precedents, that human cultures had been exchanging and adapting narratives for millennia before the composition of Genesis, but the tablet was fragmentary. Crucial portions of the text were missing. Smith knew that somewhere in the museum's vast, poorly cataloged collection, there might be additional fragments that could complete the narrative. And beyond that, in the ruins of Nineveh itself, buried under centuries of sand and debris, there might be complete tablets that could provide the full context of this flood story. The British Museum recognized the significance of Smith's discovery. The Daily Telegraph newspaper agreed to fund an archaeological expedition to Nineveh specifically to search for the missing portions of the flood tablet. In May 1873, less than a year after his initial discovery, George Smith found himself on a ship bound for the Ottoman Empire, heading toward the ancient ruins of Mesopotamia. The journey from London to Mosul, the nearest city to Nineveh, took weeks. Smith traveled by steamship across the Mediterranean, then by horse and carriage across difficult terrain. He kept a journal of his travels, noting the landscape, the people he met, the difficulties of navigating Ottoman bureaucracy. When he finally reached Nineveh in late May, he confronted a scene of almost total desolation. The great city of Nineveh, once the capital of the Assyrian Empire, was now a series of mounds called Kuyunjik and Nebi Yunus, overlooking the Tigris River. Local people had built houses on top of the ancient ruins. Previous excavations had left trenches and pits scattered across the site. Smith hired local workers and began the painstaking process of sifting through the debris of previous excavations, searching for tablet fragments that earlier archaeologists might have overlooked. The working conditions were brutal. Summer temperatures in northern Iraq regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Water was scarce and often contaminated. Smith suffered from dysentery and heat exhaustion. The work itself was backbreaking, supervising dozens of local workers as they moved tons of earth, examining every fragment of clay that emerged from the ground, trying to distinguish between ancient tablets and the countless pieces of ordinary pottery that littered the site. And yet incredibly, within just 5 days of beginning excavation, Smith found it. A clay tablet fragment about 3 inches square, covered in cuneiform text. He cleaned it carefully and began to translate. It was part of the missing flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh. The fragment described how the flood hero, here named Utnapishtim, had survived the deluge and been granted immortality by the gods. The probability of finding this specific fragment among the hundreds of thousands of clay pieces scattered across the ruins of Nineveh seems almost impossible, and yet Smith had done it, guided by his intimate knowledge of the cuneiform script, his understanding of how tablets were organized in ancient libraries, and perhaps by extraordinary luck. He immediately sent a telegram to the Daily Telegraph announcing his discovery. But here is where the story becomes more complex, more troubling. Smith returned to London in triumph, his expedition deemed a spectacular success. He published his translation of the Flood Tablet in December 1873, creating a sensation in Victorian society. Clergy debated the implications for biblical authority. Scholars argued about the relationship between Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions. The popular press sensationalized the discovery, with some newspapers claiming that Smith had found proof that the Bible was merely a collection of ancient myths. Smith himself seems to have been overwhelmed by the attention. He was not a gifted public speaker, and he lacked the social skills to navigate the heated debates his discovery had ignited. More troublingly, his translation of the Flood Tablet contained several significant errors. His understanding of Akkadian grammar was imperfect, and he made assumptions about the text based on his familiarity with the biblical account. Later scholars would correct many of these errors, but Smith's initial translation shaped public perception of the Mesopotamian flood narrative. Moreover, the very context of Smith's discovery was problematic. The tablets he studied were war booty, removed from Iraq without the consent of local populations, at a time when the Ottoman Empire controlled the region, but Britain wielded considerable imperial power. The narrative of a self-taught British scholar discovering the literary heritage of ancient Mesopotamia obscured the reality that this heritage belonged to the modern peoples of Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, who were the descendants of the ancient cultures that had created these texts. And what of the tablets themselves? What story were they actually telling? Smith believed he had found evidence of a great flood that predated and possibly inspired the biblical account. But as more tablets were discovered and translated in subsequent decades, a more complex picture emerged. The flood story appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts spanning over 1,000 years, with significant variations in details. The hero's name changes, sometimes Utnapishtim, sometimes Atrahasis, sometimes Yusudra. The reason for the flood varies. Sometimes it's because humanity has become too numerous and noisy. Sometimes because humans have become wicked, sometimes for no clear reason at all. What Smith had actually discovered was evidence that ancient Mesopotamian cultures told and retold flood stories across many centuries, adapting them to serve different purposes. These weren't historical accounts of an actual event, but mythological narratives that helped ancient peoples make sense of the unpredictable flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which could indeed destroy entire cities and reshape the landscape. But there's another dimension to this story, one that Smith could not have anticipated and that continues to reverberate today. In the late 20th century, a small group of amateur archaeologists and alternative historians seized upon Smith's discovery and subsequent translations of Sumerian texts to construct a radical new theory about human origins. They claimed that these ancient texts contain not myths, but historical accounts of humanity's creation by extraterrestrial beings. How did we get from George Smith's scholarly work on ancient flood narratives to claims about alien intervention in human evolution? The path is winding and reveals much about how genuine scholarship can be distorted and repurposed to serve ideological agendas. But to understand this transformation, we must first return to those basement rooms in the British Museum, to the thousands of untranslated tablets still waiting to be read, and to the question that George Smith's discovery raised but could not answer. What did the ancient Sumerians and Babylonians actually believe about the origins of humanity? And why does it matter to us today, more than 150 years after a self-taught scholar first held that fragmentary flood tablet in his trembling hands? You are sitting in a library in 1902, 30 years after George Smith's death, and you are reading a newly published translation of a Sumerian text that describes the creation of humanity. The translator is a German Assyriologist named Hermann Hilprecht, and the text he has painstakingly reconstructed from dozens of clay fragments is called the Eridu Genesis. It tells a story that is both familiar and deeply strange. According to this ancient Sumerian narrative, the gods created humans to perform labor, specifically to dig irrigation canals and maintain the agricultural systems that kept the Mesopotamian cities fed. Humanity was not the pinnacle of divine creation, beloved children of a benevolent father, but workers, designed and manufactured to serve a practical purpose. The text describes how the gods debated the creation of humans, how they experimented with different designs, and how they eventually settled on a formula that worked. This is profoundly different from the Genesis account, where God creates humans in his own image and gives them dominion over the earth. In the Sumerian version, humans are created in the image of the God's needs. We are tools, however sophisticated, designed to solve a problem the gods faced. Let me take you deeper into this. To understand why these tablets matter, you need to understand the actual process by which they were discovered, translated, and interpreted. This is not a story of sudden revelations, but of decades of painstaking scholarly work, of debates over the meaning of individual cuneiform signs, of gradually reconstructing ancient worldviews from fragmentary evidence. After George Smith's death in 1876, he died of dysentery during his third expedition to Nineveh at age 36. The work of translating and interpreting Mesopotamian texts continued. New excavations in Iraq uncovered thousands more tablets. Academic institutions in Britain, Germany, France, and America competed to acquire these artifacts and to train scholars in the complex languages of ancient Mesopotamia. One of the most significant developments came with the deeper study of Sumerian texts. The Sumerians were the earliest known civilization in southern Mesopotamia, flourishing from approximately 4000 BCE to 2000 BCE. They invented cuneiform writing, built the first cities, and created a sophisticated literature. Later Babylonian and Assyrian cultures inherited much of Sumerian mythology and religion, often translating Sumerian texts into Akkadian. Sumerian was unrelated to any known language family, neither Semitic like Akkadian and Hebrew, nor Indo-European like Greek and Latin. It was an isolate with its own unique grammar and vocabulary. Learning to read Sumerian required scholars to master not only the cuneiform script, but also the language's complex system of verbal conjugations, its use of postpositions rather than prepositions, and its tendency to express concepts through compound words. The early translators of Sumerian texts struggled with fundamental questions. How do you pronounce a dead language when you have no recordings of native speakers? How do you determine the meaning of a word when you have limited context and no bilingual dictionaries? The scholars developed elaborate systems of comparison using Akkadian translations of Sumerian texts created by ancient Babylonian scribes as a kind of Rosetta Stone. One of the pioneers in this work was François Thiroux d'Anjin, a French Assyriologist who published translations of Sumerian royal inscriptions in the 1900s. Another was Arnaud Poebel, who worked on Sumerian grammatical texts. These scholars were not romantically searching for ancient wisdom or evidence of lost civilizations. They were linguists and philologists, interested in understanding how Sumerian worked as a language and what its literature could tell us about the society that produced it. Among the texts they translated were creation narratives, stories explaining how the world came to be and how humanity was made. These were not uniform accounts. Different cities in ancient Sumer had different patron deities and told different versions of creation stories. The city of Eridu, one of the oldest Sumerian settlements, had its own creation myth. The city of Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, had another version. Later Babylonian texts synthesized and adapted these various traditions. The Eridu Genesis, the text you're reading in that 1902 library, describes a time before the creation of humanity, when the gods themselves had to perform all the labor of maintaining civilization. They dug canals, they carried dirt, they planted crops. This was exhausting work, and the gods eventually rebelled, refusing to continue. The solution was to create a substitute laborer, humanity. The text describes how the goddess Ninhursag, called Nintu in some versions, mixed clay with the blood of a slain god to create the first humans. The divine blood gave humans intelligence and the breath of life. The clay gave them mortality and physical form. Humans were thus hybrid beings, part divine, part earthly, created to bridge the gap between the realm of the gods and the physical world. Different Sumerian and Babylonian texts elaborate on this basic narrative. The Atrahasis epic, an old Babylonian text from around 1700 BCE, provides more detail about the rebellion of the gods and the creation of humanity. It specifies that 7 male and 7 female humans were created, and that humans were designed to reproduce and spread across the earth. The text also explains that humans were given a limited lifespan to prevent overpopulation. The gods wanted workers, but not so many that they would consume all the world's resources. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic discovered among Ashurbanipal's tablets and translated in the late 19th century, tells yet another version. In this account, humanity is created from the blood of Chingu, a rebel god defeated in battle. The god Marduk, victorious in the cosmic war, decides to create humans specifically to free the gods from labor. The text says explicitly, "Let him be burdened with the toil of the gods, that they may freely breathe." Reading these texts in the early 20th century, scholars recognized that they represented a radically different understanding of humanity's place in the cosmos compared to the Judeo-Christian tradition. In the biblical account, humans are created last as the crown of creation and given stewardship over the earth. In the Mesopotamian accounts, humans are created as an afterthought, a practical solution to a labor shortage, and our purpose is to serve the gods through agriculture, temple building, and ritual offerings. This raised profound questions. Were these texts purely mythological, symbolic expressions of ancient peoples' understanding of the social order? Mesopotamian society was indeed highly stratified, with kings claiming divine authority and a vast laboring class performing the agricultural and construction work that sustained the cities. The creation myths could be read as religious justifications for this social structure. If humans were created to labor for the gods, then surely ordinary people should labor for the god-kings who represented divine authority on earth. Or did these texts preserve some memory of actual historical events, distorted and mythologized over thousands of years? Some scholars in the early 20th century speculated that the Mesopotamian flood stories and creation narratives might contain kernels of historical truth, perhaps memories of actual catastrophic floods, of migrations of peoples, of the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural civilizations. The problem with this second interpretation is that it requires us to accept that oral traditions can preserve accurate information across thousands of years, which seems unlikely. The Sumerian texts were written down around 2500–2000 BCE, but they claim to describe events from the beginning of time. Even if we assume they preserve oral traditions from earlier periods, we're talking about a potential time gap of thousands of years between the supposed events and their recording. Most scholars settled on a middle position. These texts tell us not about actual historical events, but about how ancient Mesopotamians understood and explained their world. The creation myths were functional narratives, providing answers to fundamental questions. Where do we come from? Why do we die? Why must we work? What is our relationship to the divine? But here's where the story takes a strange turn. In the mid-20th century, as archaeology in Iraq and neighboring countries uncovered more Sumerian sites and tablets, a new generation of scholars began to study these texts with fresh perspectives. One of these scholars was Samuel Noah Kramer, an American Assyriologist who devoted his career to Sumerian literature. Kramer published extensively on Sumerian texts in the 1940s through 1970s, producing accessible translations intended for general readers. His most famous book, History Begins at Sumer, 1956, presented the Sumerians as the originators of numerous firsts in human civilization: the first schools, the first legal codes, the first proverbs, the first literary debates. Kramer's work was scholarly and rigorous, but it also promoted a view of Sumer as the fountainhead of human civilization, the place where recorded history truly began. This emphasis on Sumerian priority and sophistication had unintended consequences. It created a popular perception that the Sumerians possessed advanced knowledge that somehow exceeded what we would expect from an ancient civilization. Their mathematical system used base 60, which we still use for measuring time and angles. Their astronomical observations were remarkably precise. Their literature explored complex philosophical and ethical questions. In reality, these achievements reflected the natural development of a civilization that had been building urban societies for over 1,000 years. The Sumerians were brilliant, but their brilliance was human brilliance, the accumulated knowledge of generations of scribes, priests, mathematicians, and astronomers passed down through the writing system they had invented. Yet the tablets themselves seemed to hint at mysteries. Sumerian texts contained lists of antediluvian kings, rulers who supposedly reigned before the Great Flood, with impossibly long reigns. One king is said to have ruled for 200 years, another for 36,000 years. The Sumerian king list presents these figures matter-of-factly, as though they were historical records rather than mythological claims. How should we interpret such texts? Ancient Mesopotamian scribes were sophisticated thinkers, capable of abstract reasoning and complex calculations. They understood the difference between myth and history. So when they wrote down these impossibly long reigns, what did they mean? Most scholars interpret these figures as symbolic or as reflecting a different understanding of time. Perhaps the years represent something other than solar years, seasons, lunar cycles, or purely symbolic numbers. Perhaps the antediluvian kings represent dynasties rather than individuals. Or perhaps these figures reflect the Mesopotamian belief that the distant past was qualitatively different from the present, a mythical time when the gods walked the earth and human lifespans were much longer. But in the 1960s and 1970s, a different interpretation began to emerge in popular culture, promoted by writers outside the academic mainstream. These writers looked at the Sumerian texts and saw not mythology, but misinterpreted history. They argued that the gods described in Sumerian texts were not supernatural beings, but extraterrestrial visitors, advanced aliens who came to Earth, genetically engineered humans to serve as a labor force, and then left, leaving behind garbled memories of their intervention that became the basis for our creation myths. This interpretation would eventually become a global phenomenon, spawning best-selling books, television series, and a whole subculture of alternative archaeology. But it began with a specific misreading of specific tablets, a misreading that was only possible because the careful scholarly work of translating and contextualizing Sumerian texts had made these texts accessible to people who lacked the training to interpret them properly. The most influential proponent of this extraterrestrial interpretation was Zecharia Sitchin, a Russian-born author who moved to Israel and then to the United States. Sitchin had studied ancient Hebrew and was an avid amateur Assyriologist. In 1976, he published The 12th Planet, the first book in his Earth Chronicles series, which would eventually encompass 7 books and sell millions of copies worldwide. Sitchin's thesis was startling and to many readers compelling. He claimed that the Sumerian texts, when properly translated, revealed that an advanced extraterrestrial race called the Anunnaki had come to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago from a planet called Nibiru. According to Sitchin, these beings needed gold to save their own planet's atmosphere, and they began mining operations on Earth. Finding the work too difficult, they genetically engineered Homo sapiens by combining their own DNA with that of Homo erectus, creating a hybrid species capable of intelligent thought but subservient to the Anunnaki. Sitchin argued that all the major events described in Sumerian and biblical texts, the creation of humanity, the flood, the Tower of Babel, were historical events involving the Anunnaki. He claimed that the impossibly long reigns of the antediluvian kings reflected the actual lifespans of these extraterrestrial beings. He interpreted every mention of gods, divine beings, or celestial events in ancient texts as evidence of alien visitation. To support his claims, Sitchin offered his own translations of Sumerian terms. He translated Anunnaki as those who from heaven to earth came. Academic scholars translate it more prosaically as princely offspring, or offspring of Anu, referring to the Sumerian sky god. He claimed that Sumerian cylinder seals depicted astronomical knowledge that ancient peoples could not have possessed without extraterrestrial help. He argued that Sumerian descriptions of the creation of humanity matched modern genetic engineering procedures. Professional Assyriologists immediately recognized that Sitchin's translations were wildly inaccurate. He confused Sumerian and Akkadian terms, mistranslated fundamental grammatical structures, and imposed modern concepts onto ancient texts. His reading of cylinder seals as astronomical diagrams was pure fantasy. These were religious scenes depicting mythological narratives, not scientific illustrations. But Sitchin's books became enormously popular, particularly among readers frustrated with conventional religion and attracted to the idea that humanity had extraterrestrial origins. His work spawned an entire genre of alternative history focused on ancient aliens. Television shows like Ancient Aliens would later popularize these ideas even further, presenting Sitchin's theories alongside more recent speculations about extraterrestrial influence on human civilization. What made Sitchin's interpretation so appealing? Partly it offered a seemingly scientific explanation for religious mysteries. Instead of faith-based acceptance of divine creation, Sitchin promised evidence-based understanding of humanity's origins. His theory was materialist. No supernatural gods, just advanced aliens using advanced technology, which appealed to readers with scientific training who nonetheless found conventional Darwinian evolution unsatisfying or insufficient. Sitchin's theory also resonated with deeper cultural anxieties and desires. It suggested that humans are special, that we are part of a cosmic drama involving multiple intelligent species. It implied that our creators might return someday, for good or ill. It provided explanations for perceived anomalies in human history, the sudden appearance of civilization, the construction of massive monuments like the pyramids, the existence of similar myths across different cultures. But here's what you need to understand about the actual Sumerian tablets and what they really say. The scholars who spent decades learning to read cuneiform, who compared thousands of tablets to reconstruct Sumerian grammar, who traced the evolution of Mesopotamian religious concepts across centuries, these scholars found no evidence whatsoever of extraterrestrial visitors. What they found was exactly what you would expect: the literature of an ancient civilization trying to make sense of its world, using the conceptual vocabulary available to it. The Sumerian creation texts describe gods who behave like humans. They get tired, they argue, they make mistakes, they need food and drink, provided through offerings. These are not depictions of advanced aliens, but anthropomorphized natural forces and social principles. The god Enlil represents wind and authority. The goddess Inanna represents love and warfare. Enki represents wisdom and fresh water. These deities personify the powers that ancient Mesopotamians saw shaping their lives. The description of humanity's creation from clay mixed with divine blood is not a garbled account of genetic engineering. It's a sophisticated theological statement about human nature. We are mortal, clay, but possess divine intelligence, blood. We are tied to the earth, but capable of understanding the cosmos. This is poetry, not laboratory procedure. And yet the question persists: why do these ancient texts matter? Why, more than a century after George Smith first translated the Flood Tablet, are we still arguing about what Sumerian creation myths mean? What is it about these clay fragments covered in wedge-shaped marks made by long-dead scribes that continues to provoke such intense debate and such wildly different interpretations? You are sitting in a university library in 2005 reading a devastating academic critique of Zecharia Sitchin's translations. The author is Michael Heiser, a biblical scholar with training in ancient Near Eastern languages, and he is systematically dismantling Sitchin's claims by demonstrating that Sitchin repeatedly mistranslated basic Sumerian and Akkadian words, confused different languages, and invented connections between texts that no reputable scholar recognizes. The critique is thorough, detailed, and damning. Heiser shows that Sitchin claimed to read Sumerian, but consistently made errors that no trained scholar would make. He demonstrates that Sitchin's translation of Anunnaki as "those who from heaven to earth came" is grammatically impossible in Sumerian. He proves that the cylinder seals Sitchin interpreted as astronomical diagrams are standard religious scenes that have been correctly identified for decades. And yet, as you read this critique, you realize something troubling. Almost no one who believes Sitchin's theories will ever read this refutation. Sitchin's books have sold millions of copies. Heiser's academic paper will be read by perhaps a few thousand scholars. The popular television shows and websites that promote ancient alien theories will never mention this systematic debunking. The truth about what the Sumerian tablets actually say is vastly less accessible than the sensationalized misinterpretations. This is the strange paradox at the heart of this story. We have the tablets. We can read them. Hundreds of scholars have dedicated their lives to translating and interpreting them accurately. And yet the popular understanding of these texts is almost completely divorced from what they actually say. How did this happen? To understand, we need to examine the actual process of how Sitchin developed his theories and how they spread, despite being completely rejected by academic scholars. This requires us to follow a trail that leads through the counterculture movements of the 1960s and 70s, through the rise of pseudo-archaeology, and into the modern landscape of alternative history media. Zecharia Sitchin was born in 1920 in Baku, Azerbaijan, then part of the Russian Empire, to a Jewish family. His family moved to British Mandate Palestine when he was young, and he grew up in Tel Aviv. He studied economics at the London School of Economics and worked as a journalist and editor in Israel before moving to New York in the 1950s. This biographical background is important. Sitchin had no formal training in Assyriology, no academic credentials in ancient languages, and never held a position at any university or research institution. However, Sitchin was clearly intelligent and well-read. He taught himself ancient Hebrew and claimed to have studied Sumerian using published grammars and dictionaries. He spent years reading translations of Mesopotamian texts and visiting museums to examine artifacts. He was not a charlatan in the sense of deliberately fabricating evidence. He genuinely believed he had discovered something that academic scholars had missed or were suppressing. The intellectual climate of the 1960s and 70s was conducive to such alternative theories. The counterculture movement had created widespread skepticism about established authorities, including academic institutions. Books like Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods in 1968 had popularized the idea that ancient monuments were created with extraterrestrial help. The space race had made the possibility of intelligent alien life seem more plausible and immediate, and there was a growing market for alternative spiritual and historical ideas that challenged conventional Judeo-Christian narratives. Sitchin's first book, The 12th Planet, was published by Stein and Day, a mainstream publisher that had also published controversial books on various topics. The book's success was immediate and surprising. Here was a theory that claimed to be based on careful reading of ancient texts, not channeled information or mystical revelation, but scholarly research. Sitchin presented pages of footnotes, citations of tablets by their museum catalog numbers, and reproductions of cuneiform texts. To a lay reader, this looked authoritative and scientific. The book's core argument was elegantly simple. According to Sitchin, there is a 10th planet in our solar system. He counted the moon and sun as planets following ancient conventions, hence 12th planet, called Nibiru, which has an extremely elongated orbit that brings it near Earth every 30,600 years. This planet is home to the Anunnaki, an advanced civilization that visited Earth approximately 450,000 years ago. Sitchin claimed that the Anunnaki established settlements in southern Mesopotamia, which he identified with the biblical Eden, and began mining gold, which they needed to repair their planet's atmosphere. After a rebellion by Anunnaki workers who were exhausted from mining labor, an event Sitchin claimed was recorded in the Atrahasis epic, the Anunnaki leadership decided to create a primitive worker by genetically engineering the existing hominids on Earth. According to Sitchin's interpretation, the Sumerian goddess Ninhursag, whom he called by various names, including Ninmah, was a geneticist who conducted experiments mixing Anunnaki DNA with Homo erectus DNA, eventually creating Homo sapiens. He claimed that the biblical phrase, "Let us make man in our image," Genesis chapter 1-26, with its puzzling plural, us, was a fragment of this genetic engineering decision, and that the Sumerian texts provided the original, uncensored version of events. Sitchin went on to argue that all subsequent human history was shaped by interactions between humans and the Anunnaki. He claimed that the biblical flood was caused by the Anunnaki's knowledge of an impending natural disaster, possibly related to Nibiru's approach, that Mesopotamian kingship was instituted by the Anunnaki, and that the Anunnaki eventually left Earth but might return when Nibiru's orbit brings them back. To support these claims, Sitchin offered detailed analyses of Sumerian texts, archaeological sites, and artifacts. He discussed the Sumerian king list and its impossibly long reigns. He examined cylinder seals, arguing that they depicted planetary systems and astronomical knowledge beyond ancient capabilities. He analyzed the layout of ancient cities, claiming they were designed as functional complexes for Anunnaki operations. He even attempted to reconcile his theory with modern genetics, arguing that the sudden appearance of Homo sapiens in the fossil record 200,000 years ago coincided with the Anunnaki's genetic engineering program. The problem is that virtually every specific claim Sitchin made about Sumerian texts was demonstrably wrong. Let me give you concrete examples because this matters. The authority of Sitchin's work rested on his claim to be accurately translating ancient sources that academic scholars were misinterpreting or ignoring. Take the word Anunnaki. In Sumerian, this is written as Anunnaki or Anunnakiforni. The term is generally understood by scholars to mean princely offspring or offspring of Anu, Anu being the sky god who headed the Sumerian pantheon. It refers to a class of deities in Mesopotamian religion, important gods who determined fates and influenced human affairs, in contrast to the Igigi, who were lesser gods or divine servants. Sitchin claimed that Anunnaki literally means those who from heaven to earth came. To arrive at this translation, he broke the word into components, Ana, to, ki, earth, and invented a reading of Nunna as heaven. But this parsing is grammatically impossible in Sumerian. The actual Sumerian phrase for those who from heaven to earth came would be constructed entirely differently, using the Sumerian verb system and grammatical particles that Sitchin ignored. Hundreds of tablets mention the Anunnaki, and in every context they are clearly divine beings in the traditional sense. They receive offerings. They inhabit temples. They are invoked in prayers and incantations. There is never any suggestion that they came from another planet, built spacecraft, or conducted genetic experiments. These are gods in the same sense that Zeus and Apollo were gods, powerful, immortal beings who controlled aspects of the natural and social world, but clearly imagined as supernatural rather than extraterrestrial. Or consider Sitchin's interpretation of Sumerian descriptions of creation. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, there is a passage describing how the god Marduk defeated the goddess Tiamat, who represented primordial chaos, often symbolized as salt water. After defeating Tiamat, Marduk splits her body and uses one half to create the sky and the other to create the earth. Sitchin interpreted this as a description of an actual planetary collision, a 10th planet, which he identified with Marduk, or later with Nibiru, colliding with a larger planet, Tiamat, in the early solar system, with the debris from this collision forming Earth and the asteroid belt. He claimed this demonstrated advanced astronomical knowledge and was a historical account of solar system formation. But the Enuma Elish is transparently mythological in genre and intent. It describes Marduk creating constellations, establishing the calendar, appointing gods to their various roles. The text is about cosmogony, the origin of the world, and theology, the supremacy of Marduk and Babylon, not astronomy. Ancient Mesopotamians did not have knowledge of the solar system's formation. They couldn't have, lacking telescopes or any means of observing other planets in detail. The attempt to read modern astrophysics into this ancient myth requires ignoring the text's actual content and context. Professional Assyriologists responded to Sitchin's work with a mixture of exasperation and dismissal. Some wrote detailed refutations, like Michael Heiser's. Others simply ignored the books as too obviously wrong to warrant response. The problem was that Sitchin's audience was not academics but general readers, and most general readers had no way to evaluate competing translation claims. If Sitchin says that a Sumerian word means one thing, and an academic scholar says it means something else, how is a reader with no knowledge of Sumerian supposed to judge who is correct? Sitchin's translations supported an exciting paradigm-shifting theory. The academic translations produced mundane religious texts about ancient gods and myths. Which version is more likely to attract readers? Sitchin published a dozen books between 1976 and 2010. He died in 2010 at age 90, expanding his theory to encompass Egyptian civilization, biblical prophecy, and speculation about future Anunnaki return. His books were translated into dozens of languages. He lectured widely, appeared on radio programs and television documentaries, and inspired countless websites and discussion groups. More significantly, Sitchin's work inspired other authors to develop similar theories. Books like The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life by Drunvalo Melchizedek, Genesis Revisited, one of Sitchin's own titles, and countless others built on the foundation Sitchin had laid. The History Channel launched Ancient Aliens in 2009, a television series that would run for over 200 episodes, popularizing ancient astronaut theories to an even wider audience. What's particularly interesting is how Sitchin's theories evolved in the hands of his followers and popularizers. Sitchin himself tried to maintain a veneer of scholarly rigor, citing tablet numbers and archaeological reports. Later, ancient alien theorists abandoned even this pretense, making ever more extravagant claims with less and less evidence. The theory metastasized, incorporating everything from Atlantis to the Nazca Lines to the construction of the pyramids. Academic scholars found themselves in a frustrating position. They could see that Sitchin's translations were wrong, but refuting them required technical linguistic arguments that were difficult to make accessible to general audiences. Moreover, Sitchin's supporters often claimed that academics were engaged in a conspiracy of silence, suppressing revolutionary discoveries that threatened established paradigms. This conspiratorial framework made academic criticism seem like confirmation of the theory's importance. The situation was made worse by the fact that legitimate scholarly work on Sumerian texts raised genuinely puzzling questions. For instance, the Sumerian king list really does attribute impossibly long reigns to early kings. Sumerian texts really do describe the gods creating humans to perform labor. There really are similarities between Mesopotamian flood stories and the biblical account. Ancient Mesopotamians really did have sophisticated astronomical knowledge. None of these facts require extraterrestrial explanations. All can be understood within the context of ancient mythology, oral tradition, and the development of early science. But they provide enough ambiguity that alternative interpretations can seem plausible to readers unfamiliar with how ancient texts work and how scholars interpret them. Consider the genuine mystery of how cuneiform was deciphered in the first place. In the 1840s, Henry Rawlinson climbed the Behistun Cliff in Persia to copy an inscription in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian, carved by order of Darius I. By comparing the 3 versions and using knowledge of Old Persian, scholars gradually worked out how to read Akkadian cuneiform. This was an extraordinary intellectual achievement, requiring years of painstaking work by multiple scholars. But once the code was cracked, thousands of tablets became readable, and what they revealed was ordinary. Tax records, legal disputes, medical prescriptions, hymns to gods, letters between merchants, lists of offerings to temples, the occasional epic poem or royal inscription. This was not the hidden wisdom of a lost super-civilization. It was the everyday written output of an ancient urban society. Yet Sitchin and his followers argued that academics were reading the texts too literally, missing the encoded advanced knowledge. This put scholars in an impossible position. How do you prove that a text doesn't contain hidden meanings? You can show what it clearly does say, but you can't exhaustively demonstrate everything it doesn't secretly mean. The broader context here matters enormously. Sitchin's theories emerged during a period when public trust in academic institutions was declining, when New Age spirituality was blending with scientific-sounding theories, and when the prospect of discovering intelligent alien life seemed increasingly plausible given advances in astronomy and space exploration. His work offered a grand unified theory that explained religion, archaeology, and biology, while positioning humanity in a cosmic context. Moreover, Sitchin's theory had theological appeal for some readers. It offered an alternative to both biblical literalism and materialistic atheism. You could believe in humanity's special creation without accepting the traditional religious framework. You could explain the Bible's divine beings without supernatural faith. The Anunnaki were real, physical beings who could be understood scientifically, not faith claims requiring submission to religious authority. But here's what got lost in all of this: the actual Sumerian tablets and what they really tell us about how an ancient civilization understood the world. The real tablets are fascinating documents that reveal sophisticated theological thinking, complex literary traditions, and the gradual development of human understanding about nature, society, and cosmos. They show us people grappling with the same questions we still ask: where do we come from? Why do we die? What is our purpose? And developing answers that made sense within their intellectual framework. When we replace this real history with fantasies about ancient aliens, we lose something valuable. We lose the opportunity to understand how human culture and thought evolved, how different societies developed different answers to universal questions, and how our modern worldview emerged from ancient roots. We also do a disservice to the Sumerian civilization itself, reducing their genuine achievements: the invention of writing, the development of mathematics, the creation of urban societies, to the supposed gifts of extraterrestrial visitors. The irony is that the truth about the Sumerian tablets is actually more interesting than Sitchin's fiction. These clay documents, preserved by accident when libraries burned, give us direct access to the thoughts of people who lived 4,000 years ago. We can read their poems, their prayers, their business letters, their medical texts. We can trace how their ideas about gods and humanity evolved over centuries. We can see them arguing with each other, loving each other, fearing death, celebrating life. But to access this real history, you have to be willing to learn about ancient languages, archaeological context, and the patient methods of scholarly research. You have to accept that understanding the past requires expertise, that not all interpretations are equally valid, and that spectacular theories require spectacular evidence. And this, perhaps, is the real lesson of Zecharia Sitchin's mistranslations. Not just that he got the words wrong, but that he represents a broader cultural tendency to prefer entertaining fiction over complex truth. The question then becomes, why did Sitchin's mistranslations succeed so spectacularly where accurate translations failed to capture public imagination? What does this tell us about how we consume history, how we evaluate evidence, and what we want from the past? And most importantly, what are we missing about the real Sumerian tablets because we're too distracted by fantasies about ancient aliens? You are holding a clay tablet in your hands, not literally, of course, but imaginatively. It is approximately the size of your palm, roughly rectangular, with slightly curved edges. The surface is covered with hundreds of tiny wedge-shaped marks, impressed into the clay when it was wet, then baked hard. Some marks are clear and crisp. Others are worn or damaged. This particular tablet is cataloged as K3473 plus K3567 plus K11641 in the British Museum's collection. It is actually 3 fragments that have been matched together to form a more complete tablet. The tablet contains part of the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish. If you could read Akkadian cuneiform, you would see that it describes how the god Marduk organized the cosmos after defeating Tiamat, establishing the calendar, creating the constellations, and then creating humanity. The section on human creation reads, in a scholarly translation, "Blood I will mass and cause bones to be. I will establish a savage, man shall be his name. Truly, savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease." Let me walk you through what this actually means, because this is the heart of the matter, what the Sumerian and Babylonian tablets really say about human origins when translated accurately and understood in context. First, the basics of translation. Akkadian cuneiform uses a complex writing system where the same sign can represent different sounds or concepts depending on context. The sign for star can also mean sky or God, depending on how it's used. There are determinatives, signs that aren't pronounced but indicate the category of the following word. Is it a personal name, a place name, a wooden object? The word order differs from English. Akkadian uses a system of verbal stems that modify meaning in ways that don't map neatly onto English tenses. So when scholars translate, "I will establish a savage, man shall be his name," they are making interpretive choices. The Akkadian word translated as savage is lulu, which can mean primitive, wild, or ignorant. It doesn't necessarily imply violence, but rather a lack of civilization or refinement. The phrase "shall be charged with the service of the gods" translates luput ma parsi ilani, literally something like, "may he bear the yoke burden of the god's rights duties." This is not a metaphor for genetic engineering. It's a straightforward theological statement. Humans exist to perform religious and agricultural labor that sustains the temples and, by extension, the gods. In ancient Mesopotamian belief, gods needed to be fed through offerings, bread, beer, meat, textiles produced by human labor. The ziggurats weren't just symbolic structures. They were imagined as literal houses where gods dwelt and needed material sustenance. Now let's look at another text, the Atrahasis epic, which Sitchin frequently cited. This old Babylonian text, circa 1700 BCE, contains the most detailed account of human creation in Mesopotamian literature. The relevant section describes how the gods were exhausted from digging canals and maintaining the agricultural infrastructure. The lesser gods, sometimes called the Igigi, rebel and go on strike, refusing to work anymore. The senior gods meet to discuss the crisis. The god Enki proposes a solution: create a substitute worker. The text says that the goddess Nintu, also called Belet Ili, Lady of the Gods, should create humans. To do this, she is instructed to mix clay with the flesh and blood of a god who is slaughtered for this purpose, Ilu, a god who apparently had rationality or intelligence. The text specifies that 7 males and 7 females are created. The detailed process description fascinated Sitchin, who saw it as a garbled account of genetic engineering. But read in context, it's clearly ritual or mythological language. The goddess Nintu places the clay and divine blood mixture in her womb. She's described as a birth goddess. After 10 months, the period of human gestation, humans are born. The birth is assisted by 14 birth goddesses who each take one of the clay figures. This is not genetics, it's birth magic. The text is explaining human nature through the logic of birth and parenthood. We come from the earth, clay, but have divine attributes, the blood and flesh of a god. We are mortal but intelligent. We are born from goddesses and thus are both divine and earthly. This dual nature explains why humans are special among earthly creatures, but still far below the gods. The Atrahasis epic continues by describing how humans multiply and spread across the earth, becoming numerous and noisy. The god Enlil, disturbed by the racket humans make, decides to reduce the population, first through plague, then through drought, then through famine. Each time, the god Enki finds ways to help humanity survive. Finally, Enlil decides to send a great flood to wipe out humanity entirely. But Enki warns Atrahasis, the Sumerian equivalent of Noah, telling him to build a boat and save his family and animals. The flood comes, destroys civilization, and afterward the gods realize they've made a mistake. They need humans to provide offerings. So they allow Atrahasis' family to survive and repopulate the earth, but they institute birth control measures, stillbirths, infertility, celibate priestesses, to keep the human population manageable. This is a sophisticated narrative exploring tensions between gods and humans, between population growth and environmental carrying capacity, between divine power and divine dependence on human labor. It's not history, it's theodicy, an explanation for why the world is the way it is, why bad things happen, why humans are mortal. Or consider the Sumerian text known as the creation of the pickaxe, which describes how the god Enlil invented the agricultural tool that would allow humans to cultivate the earth. The text is partly celebratory, praising Enlil's wisdom, and partly explanatory, showing how civilization became possible. There's no suggestion of extraterrestrial technology, just a god figuring out how to make a practical tool. These texts, when read carefully and completely, reveal a worldview that is foreign to us, but entirely comprehensible. The Mesopotamians believed the world was governed by powerful beings who controlled natural forces. They understood that human civilization depended on organization, technology, and coordinated labor. They recognized that cities required constant maintenance. Canals had to be dug and cleaned. Fields had to be planted. Walls had to be built and repaired. Their creation myths encoded these social realities in religious terms. If maintaining civilization requires enormous labor, and if the gods are imagined as the ultimate authorities who benefit from this labor, then it makes theological sense to say that the gods created humans specifically to perform this labor. It's not literal history, it's mythological framing of social organization. We can see this clearly when we compare different versions of creation texts from different periods and cities. In earlier Sumerian texts, the god Enki is usually the wise deity who creates or helps create humans. In later Babylonian texts, Marduk takes credit, reflecting Babylon's political supremacy and the elevation of Marduk to the head of the pantheon. In Assyrian versions, Ashur receives credit. These variations show that the myths were flexible, adapted to serve political and religious purposes of different communities at different times. The tablets also contain texts that are explicitly non-mythological. There are mathematical tablets teaching calculation of areas, volumes, and square roots. There are medical tablets describing symptoms and treatments for various ailments, often with rational herbal remedies alongside magical incantations. There are astronomical tablets recording observations of Venus and other planets with remarkable precision. This astronomical work is sometimes cited by ancient alien theorists as evidence of advanced knowledge. But when you read the tablets carefully, you see ancient astronomers doing exactly what you'd expect: observing, recording patterns, attempting to predict planetary movements based on observation. They made mistakes. Their model of the cosmos was geocentric and fundamentally wrong. But they were brilliant observers working within their intellectual framework, not recipients of extraterrestrial information. One tablet records the observation of what scholars now believe was a comet impact or airburst, the Kofels event around 3000 BCE, which an Assyrian astronomer apparently witnessed and recorded. The description is detailed and, when analyzed by modern astronomers, appears to accurately describe the trajectory and impact of a celestial object. This is impressive ancient astronomy, but it's human astronomy based on direct observation and careful recording, not alien knowledge. The legal texts are equally fascinating and equally mundane. We have contracts for property sales, marriage agreements, divorce settlements, inheritance disputes, adoption records, and slave purchases. These documents show us how Mesopotamian society actually functioned, how people negotiated relationships, property, and power. They're stamped with cylinder seals, not depicting planetary systems as Sitchin claimed, but showing gods, religious scenes, and symbols of authority. The literary texts reveal sophisticated artistic sensibilities. The Epic of Gilgamesh explores mortality and meaning with psychological depth that feels remarkably modern. The dialogue of pessimism presents a master and servant discussing various life goals and concluding that all human striving is ultimately futile. Tile. It's basically ancient existentialism. The poem of the righteous sufferer, sometimes called the Babylonian Job, questions divine justice when a pious man suffers undeservedly. These texts show people thinking deeply about fundamental questions. They're not primitive or simplistic, but they're also clearly the products of their time and culture. They assume the reality of gods, the importance of ritual purity, and a worldview where the divine and earthly realms interpenetrate constantly. So why has this real content of the tablets, this genuine window into ancient thought, been so overshadowed by speculative theories about ancient aliens? Partly because the real content requires effort to understand. You need to learn about ancient Mesopotamian society, religion, and literary conventions. You need to accept that these texts don't provide simple answers to modern questions. But there's something deeper happening. The ancient alien interpretation offers something that accurate translation doesn't. It offers validation for modern discomfort with traditional religion combined with desire for human specialness. If we're genetically engineered by advanced aliens, then we're not just evolved primates, which some find depressing, and we're not required to accept religious faith, which some find intellectually untenable. We're special, created, significant, but in a scientific-sounding way. The accurate translation, by contrast, offers something less immediately satisfying, but ultimately more valuable. Insight into how other humans, radically different from us in worldview, but similar in fundamental psychology, made sense of existence. The Mesopotamians didn't know about DNA or evolution or plate tectonics. They explained human origins using the concepts available to them: gods, divine will, cosmic conflict, ritual creation. Their explanations were wrong in literal terms, but sophisticated in mythological terms. They encoded real observations about human nature. We're smart, but mortal, powerful, but limited. About social organization, civilization requires coordination and labor. And about human-environment relations, we depend on, but also shape the natural world. When we read these texts as mythology rather than garbled history, patterns emerge. Creation myths across Mesopotamian literature consistently emphasize several themes. Humans are created to work. We are hybrid beings, part divine, part earthly. We are dependent on the gods, but the gods also depend on us, and our creation was preceded by cosmic conflicts among the gods that established order from chaos. These themes reflect real features of Mesopotamian civilization. Cities did require enormous coordinated labor. Political authority was justified through religious ideology. Social hierarchy was steep, with kings claiming divine mandate. Life was precarious, dependent on successful harvests and adequate flooding of rivers. The myths make sense as cultural products of this environment. Moreover, the myths evolved. Earlier Sumerian texts from around 2500 BCE show different emphases than later Babylonian texts from 1500 BCE. The rise and fall of different cities, the conquest of Sumer by Akkad, the eventual supremacy of Babylon, all these historical developments are reflected in how the myths were told and retold. This evolution shows the myths were living traditions adapted to serve the needs of changing societies. What would it mean to truly understand the Sumerian tablets? It would mean engaging with them as the complex cultural artifacts they are, not as proof texts for predetermined theories, whether religious or extraterrestrial, but as windows into a genuinely foreign worldview that nonetheless addressed recognizably human concerns. It would mean appreciating both their strangeness and their familiarity. The tablets tell us that 4,000 years ago, people in ancient Iraq worried about the same things we worry about: where we came from, why we die, whether there's meaning in existence, how to build a good society. Their answers were different from ours, expressed in religious language we no longer use, but the questions resonate across the millennia. And here's what's particularly poignant. The tablets themselves are vulnerable. Many are stored in museums in Iraq, which has suffered through decades of war and instability. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad was looted in 2003, with unknown numbers of artifacts stolen or destroyed. Archaeological sites across Iraq have been damaged by military operations, looting, and the deliberate destruction carried out by groups like ISIS, which destroyed ancient Assyrian statues and cities, viewing them as idolatrous. Every time an ancient tablet is lost, we lose irreplaceable information about human history. These aren't just archaeological curiosities. They're primary sources, direct evidence of how ancient people thought and lived. Once gone, they cannot be replaced. And yet, while genuine tablets are being destroyed in the Middle East, false claims about what tablets supposedly say proliferate endlessly online and in popular media. The real tragedy of the ancient alien interpretation of Sumerian texts isn't just that it's wrong. It's that it distracts us from engaging with what these texts actually tell us. It replaces genuine cross-cultural understanding with fantasy. It takes documents that reveal real human intellectual history and turns them into props for modern myth-making. But what if we did the harder work of actually understanding the tablets? What if we learned enough about ancient Mesopotamia to read these texts in context? What would they tell us? Not about aliens or genetic engineering, but about the actual development of human civilization, about how writing and complex society emerged, about the first attempts to create systematic knowledge? And why does this matter here and now in the 21st century when we face our own questions about human origins, meaning, and future? You are sitting in front of a computer screen in 2019, watching a viral video that has accumulated millions of views. The video claims that ancient Sumerian tablets prove that humans were genetically engineered by aliens 400,000 years ago. The narrator speaks with confidence, showing images of clay tablets and translating specific passages that supposedly describe advanced technology and space travel. The comments section is filled with people expressing amazement, declaring that mainstream science doesn't want us to know the truth, and sharing links to similar videos. But here's what you notice if you pause and look carefully. Many of the tablets shown in the video are being misidentified. A tablet that's actually a mundane administrative record about grain rations is presented as evidence of alien visitation. A cylinder seal showing a religious scene is claimed to depict the solar system, with one planet labeled as the alien home world. The translations offered are not from academic sources, but from Sitchin's books or similar alternative history works. This is the legacy of mistranslation, not just Sitchin's original errors, but their multiplication and amplification through modern media. What began as one man's idiosyncratic reading of ancient texts has become a global phenomenon, shaping how millions of people understand human history and ancient civilizations. The scale of this phenomenon is staggering. The Ancient Aliens television series, which premiered on the History Channel in 2009, has aired over 200 episodes. Each episode typically features ancient astronaut theorists, presenting speculative interpretations of archaeological sites, ancient texts, and historical mysteries. The show has been viewed by tens of millions of people worldwide and has spawned numerous spin-offs, documentaries, and related programming. The show's format is revealing. Rather than presenting academic archaeology and then contrasting it with alternative theories, Ancient Aliens typically presents the alternative theories as equally or more plausible than conventional interpretations. Academic skepticism is portrayed as close-mindedness, or in some cases, as deliberate suppression of truth. The show's narration is structured around questions. Could ancient astronaut theorists be right? Did extraterrestrials really visit Earth thousands of years ago? That imply doubt about conventional knowledge without requiring evidence for alternative claims. This rhetorical strategy has been remarkably effective. By framing ancient alien theories as questions rather than claims, the show avoids the burden of proof while planting seeds of doubt about established archaeological knowledge. Viewers are left with the impression that there's genuine controversy among experts, when in reality the archaeological community overwhelmingly rejects these theories. The impact extends far beyond television. YouTube is filled with thousands of videos about ancient aliens, Sumerian tablets, and related topics, many with millions of views. Social media platforms amplify these theories through algorithms that prioritize engagement over accuracy. Online communities dedicated to alternative history have created echo chambers where mainstream archaeology is dismissed as dogmatic and where increasingly extreme theories are developed and shared. This has created a strange situation where people can spend hundreds of hours consuming content about ancient Mesopotamia while never encountering accurate information about what Sumerian tablets actually say. They become experts in a false version of history, able to cite specific tablet numbers and archaeological sites, but completely misinformed about the actual content and context of these sources. The consequences of this are both intellectual and practical. Intellectually, millions of people have developed a fundamentally distorted understanding of human history. They believe that ancient civilizations were more advanced than they actually were, that archaeological mysteries require exotic explanations, and that human achievement is somehow less impressive if it doesn't involve aliens. Practically, this undermines support for real archaeology and genuine historical research. Why fund careful excavation and translation when people believe the important discoveries have already been made and are being suppressed? Why trust academic experts when influencers and television producers offer more exciting narratives? The devaluation of expertise that characterizes ancient alien theories is part of a broader cultural trend of rejecting specialized knowledge in favor of democratized opinion. There's also a troubling racial dimension to these theories that often goes unnoticed. Ancient alien theories tend to be applied selectively to the achievements of non-European civilizations. The pyramids in Egypt, the Nazca Lines in Peru, the stone heads of Easter Island, the temples of Angkor Wat. These are the sites most frequently attributed to alien influence. Meanwhile, Greek philosophy, Roman engineering, and medieval European cathedrals are typically explained as human achievements. This pattern implies that ancient non-European peoples were incapable of sophisticated engineering, mathematics, or social organization without extraterrestrial help, a conclusion that echoes colonial-era racist assumptions about the intellectual capacity of different populations. The fact that this racism is unintentional for most ancient alien enthusiasts doesn't make it less harmful. It perpetuates the idea that some civilizations must have had help to achieve what they demonstrably achieved through human ingenuity and effort. Moreover, the focus on ancient aliens distracts from the real and remarkable story of how human civilization developed. The actual history of agriculture, writing, urban society, and technology is fascinating precisely because it shows human creativity and adaptability. The Sumerians didn't need aliens to invent cuneiform. They invented it themselves over centuries of experimentation, gradually moving from simple pictographs to a sophisticated writing system capable of expressing complex ideas. The development of writing is itself one of humanity's most important achievements, and we can trace its evolution through archaeological evidence. The earliest proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk, dating to around 3400 BCE, are simple administrative records, quantities of goods represented by pictographic signs and numerical notations. Over several centuries, these signs became more abstract, more phonetic, more capable of representing grammar and syntax. By 2500 BCE, Sumerian scribes could write sophisticated literature, legal documents, and scientific text. This wasn't alien technology. It was human innovation, driven by practical needs, record-keeping for complex economies, and intellectual curiosity, desire to preserve knowledge and literature. The tablets themselves show the process, with early texts being simple and later texts being increasingly complex and sophisticated. Or consider Mesopotamian mathematics. Cuneiform tablets contain multiplication tables, geometry problems, and even solutions to what we would recognize as quadratic equations. The mathematical system used base 60, sexagesimal, which is why we still divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. This system emerged because it's mathematically convenient. 60 is divisible by many factors: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, 60, making calculations easier. Ancient Babylonian mathematicians could calculate square roots. approximate the value of pi, and solve complex practical problems involving areas, volumes, and proportions. All of this is documented in clay tablets that show their work, their methods, and sometimes even their mistakes. This is human mathematics, developing over centuries through teaching, practice, and innovation, not downloaded alien knowledge. The same is true for astronomy. Babylonian astronomers kept meticulous records of celestial observations over centuries, which allowed them to discover periodic patterns in planetary movements. They could predict lunar eclipses with reasonable accuracy. They identified the zodiac constellations and tracked the precession of the equinoxes. All of this through patient observation and record keeping, without any need for extraterrestrial intervention. What made this possible was writing itself, the ability to record observations and transmit knowledge across generations. A single astronomer might observe the sky for a few decades, but with written records, astronomers could build on observations spanning centuries. This accumulation of knowledge is one of the key advantages of literate civilizations, and it's entirely a human achievement. Yet the ancient alien narrative erases all of this genuine human accomplishment. It says, in effect, that ancient peoples couldn't have been smart enough or creative enough to achieve what they demonstrably achieved. It requires us to believe that obvious mythology, gods creating humans from clay, is really garbled history, aliens engineering humans from DNA, while ignoring all the evidence of gradual technological and intellectual development. The persistence of these theories, despite their thorough debunking by experts, raises important questions about how we evaluate claims and evidence. Why are people willing to believe Sitchin's translations over those of trained Assyriologists? Why does the exotic explanation, aliens, seem more credible than the mundane explanation, human development, when the evidence overwhelmingly supports the latter? Part of the answer lies in what psychologists call motivated reasoning. We tend to accept evidence that confirms our existing beliefs and dismiss evidence that challenges them. If someone wants to believe that humanity has extraterrestrial origins, they'll find Sitchin's theories convincing and academic refutations unconvincing. The theories themselves are structured to resist falsification. Any absence of evidence is explained as suppression. Any academic criticism is dismissed as closed-mindedness. Another factor is the genuine difficulty of specialized knowledge. Learning to read cuneiform takes years of training. Understanding ancient Mesopotamian history requires familiarity with complex chronology, archaeology, and historiography. Most people don't have time or inclination to acquire this expertise, so they rely on secondary sources. If those secondary sources are unreliable, people develop unreliable knowledge and may never realize it. There's also a kind of intellectual satisfaction in believing you know something that others don't, that you've seen through the illusions that fool the masses. Ancient alien theories offer this satisfaction. You're not a sheep believing what you're told. You're an independent thinker who's discovered hidden truths. The fact that millions of others believe the same hidden truth doesn't seem to diminish its appeal. But perhaps the deepest appeal of ancient alien theories is existential. They offer a grand narrative that gives meaning to human existence. We're not just products of blind evolution. We're intentionally created beings with cosmic significance. Our creators may return. We may have a cosmic destiny. This is emotionally satisfying in ways that conventional history and evolutionary biology are not. The irony is that the real history of humanity is actually more remarkable than the ancient alien narrative. We are the species that started with stone tools and ended up landing on the moon, all through our own efforts. We created art, music, mathematics, and literature without any extraterrestrial help. We've developed from small bands of hunter-gatherers to a global civilization capable of understanding the universe at both quantum and cosmic scales. The Sumerian tablets are part of this real history. They document the early stages of civilization, showing us how writing, law, literature, and complex social organization emerged. They're valuable precisely because they're human documents created by people like us, showing us how our ancestors thought and lived. To reduce them to garbled accounts of alien visitation is to miss their actual significance. And what of the tablets themselves, the physical objects? Many remain unstudied, sitting in museum storage rooms or in private collections. There are tens of thousands of tablets that have never been fully translated or published. Every year, scholars work through a few more, gradually expanding our knowledge of ancient Mesopotamia. It's slow, careful, unglamorous work, exactly the kind of work that doesn't generate viral videos or television series. But this work matters. Each properly translated tablet adds to our understanding of human history. It shows us more about how ancient economies functioned, how people understood their world, how ideas evolved. It's cumulative knowledge building gradually toward a more complete picture of human civilization's origins. The tragedy is that while this real work continues in academic institutions, the public conversation about Sumerian tablets is dominated by demonstrably false theories. Millions of people believe they know what the tablets say, but what they know is fiction. The truth, more complex, more interesting, more meaningful, remains largely inaccessible to them, hidden behind sensationalized distortions and mistranslations. How did we arrive at this point, where fantasy is more popular than fact? What does it tell us about modern society? That ancient alien theories flourish, while genuine archaeological research struggles for funding and public attention. And is there any way to reverse this trend to help people understand what the Sumerian tablets actually say and why it matters? You are standing in the galleries of the Penn Museum in Philadelphia in 2023, looking at a display of Sumerian artifacts. There are clay tablets in cases carefully lit with English translations beside them. One is a school exercise tablet, a student's attempt to practice cuneiform signs, complete with errors that the teacher corrected. Another is a love song, 3,000 years old, expressing longing and devotion in language that still feels immediate and real. A family stands beside you, parents and two teenagers. One of the teens is taking photos with their phone. You overhear their conversation. These are the tablets that prove ancient aliens created humans, the teen says confidently. The parent looks skeptical. Where does it say that? The teen pulls out their phone, presumably to show a video that makes this claim. This scene, repeated in museums and archaeological sites worldwide, captures the current state of public understanding about ancient Mesopotamia. Physical evidence is available, properly translated and contextualized by experts, but alternative narratives circulate more widely and influence understanding more deeply than academic knowledge. So, where do we go from here? This isn't just an academic question. How we understand our past shapes how we think about our present and future. If we believe humans needed alien help to develop civilization, we're likely to underestimate human potential and overestimate the need for external saviors. If we believe established experts are lying to us about history, we're likely to distrust expertise in other domains: science, medicine, technology. The challenge facing archaeology and ancient history is not primarily about refuting specific false claims. That's been done repeatedly and thoroughly. The challenge is about communication and education, about making genuine scholarship accessible and appealing, about competing with sensationalized media in an attention economy that rewards excitement over accuracy. Some scholars and institutions are rising to this challenge. The American Schools of Oriental Research, the British Museum, and various universities maintain websites and social media presences where they share accurate information about ancient Mesopotamia. Individual scholars like Irving Finkel, a curator at the British Museum who specializes in cuneiform, have become effective public communicators, using humor and storytelling to make ancient texts engaging. Digital humanities projects are making primary sources more accessible. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative has photographed and cataloged hundreds of thousands of tablets, making them available online for researchers and interested amateurs. The open, richly annotated cuneiform corpus provides searchable texts with translations and grammatical annotations. These resources allow anyone with internet access to examine actual tablets and compare different scholarly translations. Some scholars have also directly engaged with ancient alien claims. Michael Heiser maintained a website called Sitchin is Wrong, where he systematically addressed Sitchin's translation errors. The Ancient History Encyclopedia, now World History Encyclopedia, provides free, reliable articles about Mesopotamian civilization. Archaeologists and historians increasingly use Twitter, YouTube, and podcasts to share their work and correct popular misconceptions. But these efforts face structural disadvantages. A careful academic response to a false claim takes much longer to produce than the false claim itself. Sensationalist content naturally attracts more attention than careful scholarship. Algorithms favor engagement, comments, shares, viewing time over accuracy, giving advantage to controversial and exciting content over measured and factual content. There's also the matter of funding and incentives. Scholars are rewarded professionally for publishing in peer-reviewed journals and presenting at academic conferences, not for creating popular content. Museums and universities struggle with budget constraints that make public outreach and education programs difficult to sustain. Meanwhile, alternative history content generates revenue through books, television shows, paid lectures, and advertising. The situation is further complicated by genuine disagreements among scholars. Archaeology and ancient history are not fields with perfect consensus. Experts argue about dating, interpretation, and significance of evidence. This healthy scholarly debate can be misrepresented as evidence that mainstream scholars don't really know, which is then used to justify giving equal weight to thoroughly debunked alternative theories. Yet despite these challenges, there are reasons for measured optimism. Public interest in ancient history is high. People genuinely want to understand the past. The success of alternative history content demonstrates this hunger for historical knowledge, even if it's misdirected. The audience exists. The challenge is reaching them with accurate information presented in engaging ways. Moreover, the tools for accessing primary sources and scholarly work are better than ever. 50 years ago, if you wanted to read Sumerian tablets, you needed to visit specific museums or libraries with rare books. Today, you can view high-resolution photographs of tablets, read multiple scholarly translations, and access grammatical analysis, all from your phone. The democratization of access to sources means that, in principle, anyone can verify claims about what ancient texts say. The question is whether people will use these tools, or whether the effort required to engage with primary sources will always be greater than the effort required to consume pre-packaged alternative narratives. This isn't purely an individual choice. It's shaped by education systems, media literacy, and cultural attitudes toward expertise and knowledge. Educational approaches matter enormously. Here, how do we teach young people to evaluate historical claims? How do we develop critical thinking skills that allow people to distinguish between evidence-based conclusions and speculative theories? How do we communicate the difference between legitimate scholarly debate and fringe theories without appearing dismissive or elitist? Some educators advocate teaching students how to trace claims to primary sources, how to evaluate the credentials and methods of people making claims, and how to understand the peer review process that validates scholarly work. These information literacy skills are increasingly recognized as essential in an age of abundant misinformation. There's also growing recognition that scientists and scholars need to do better at public communication. The old model, experts produce knowledge which eventually trickles down to the public, doesn't work in a media environment where anyone can produce and distribute content. Scholars need to be active participants in public discourse, willing to make their work accessible without oversimplifying it. The Sumerian tablets themselves offer a kind of lesson here. These are documents created by a literate elite for practical purposes, administration, education, religious ritual. But they were also part of a broader culture of knowledge creation and transmission. Sumerian scribes trained for years to master their craft. They copied texts to preserve them. They created libraries to organize knowledge. They understood that maintaining civilization required maintaining knowledge. Modern civilization faces similar challenges. We've accumulated vast knowledge about the world, but much of it is specialized and inaccessible to non-experts. We've developed sophisticated methods for validating knowledge claims, peer review, replication, methodological transparency, but these processes are often invisible to the public. We've created institutions to preserve and transmit knowledge, universities, museums, libraries, but these institutions face challenges in adapting to new media environments. The mistranslation of Sumerian tablets and the popularity of ancient alien theories are symptoms of a broader problem: the difficulty of maintaining shared epistemological standards, shared ways of knowing what's true in a fragmented media landscape. If we can't agree on how to evaluate claims about the past, how can we agree on anything? Yet humans have always told stories about origins, have always sought to understand where we come from and what it means. The Sumerians created myths that encoded their understanding of human nature and society. We create our own myths, sometimes consciously in our fiction and entertainment, and sometimes unconsciously in the narratives we construct about history and science. The appeal of ancient alien theories may ultimately be less about aliens than about us, our desire for significance, for connection to something larger than ourselves, for explanations that make our existence feel meaningful. These are legitimate human needs, and they won't be satisfied by simply debunking false claims. They require positive alternatives, compelling narratives that provide meaning while remaining true to evidence. The real story of the Sumerian tablets, their creation, preservation, rediscovery, and translation, is actually such a narrative. It's a story about human persistence and creativity across vast spans of time. It's about Sumerian scribes 4,000 years ago pressing wedges into wet clay to record knowledge they hoped would outlast them. It's about those tablets surviving the destruction of their civilization, buried and preserved by accident. It's about scholars like George Smith dedicating their lives to reconstructing ancient languages and recovering lost knowledge. It's about the ongoing work of translation and interpretation, slowly building understanding. This story says something profound about humanity. We create, we preserve, we remember, we understand. We build on the work of previous generations. We reach across time to connect with people who lived and died millennia ago. We're capable of remarkable intellectual achievements without any need for extraterrestrial intervention. The tablets sit in museums, waiting to be read. Each one is a message from the past if we're willing to do the work of understanding it. Not through fantasy or speculation, but through careful study, through learning ancient languages, through understanding ancient contexts. It's harder than believing sensational claims, but it's also more rewarding. When you can look at a cuneiform tablet and recognize the signs, when you can trace the wedge marks and understand the grammar, when you can read the thoughts of someone who lived in Ur or Babylon 3,000 years ago, that's genuinely magical. Not because it involves anything supernatural, but because it demonstrates the extraordinary continuity of human consciousness across time. The Sumerian creation myths tell us how ancient people understood human origins, not accurately but meaningfully. They were wrong about the mechanics, but they weren't stupid. They were observing the same world we observe, asking the same questions we ask, using the intellectual tools available to them. Understanding this requires humility, recognizing that we too are limited by our own time and tools, that future generations will probably look back on some of our cherished beliefs with the same mixture of respect and condescension we bring to ancient myths. But it also requires confidence, confidence that human intelligence, working collectively over time, can uncover truth. The decipherment of cuneiform was an extraordinary intellectual achievement. The reconstruction of Sumerian and Akkadian grammar from fragmentary texts was brilliant detective work. The ongoing translation and study of Mesopotamian tablets continues to expand our knowledge. This is science and scholarship at their best: careful, cumulative, self-correcting, open to revision, based on new evidence but requiring evidence for revision. It's not perfect, not immune to error or bias, but it's vastly more reliable than speculation and wish fulfillment. As you stand in that museum looking at those tablets, you have a choice. You can believe the sensational claims, the easy answers, the theories that require no expertise to evaluate. Or you can do the harder work of actually learning, reading the scholarly literature, understanding the methods. engaging with the evidence. The tablets don't prove humanity was created by aliens. They prove something more remarkable, that humans 5,000 years ago invented writing, built cities, created literature, pondered their existence, and left messages that we can still read today. We are their descendants, carrying forward the project of civilization they began, making our own marks that perhaps someone 5,000 years from now will try to decipher and understand. The real legacy of the Sumerian tablets is not what they supposedly reveal about our extraterrestrial origins. It's what they actually demonstrate about human capability, creativity, and continuity. We didn't need alien gods to create us. We created ourselves through millions of years of evolution and thousands of years of cultural development. That's the true story written in clay, waiting for anyone willing to learn the language to read it. And that story, properly understood, is more profound and more meaningful than any fantasy about ancient aliens could ever be.